The wind howled through Deadwater Gulch like a restless spirit, its breath biting against the skin of anyone foolish enough to be caught outside. The valley, carved deep between jagged cliffs, was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Each crag, each rock ledge seemed like a forgotten story, a part of the land no man had tamed. In the heart of it stood a weathered cabin, smoke rising in lazy curls from its chimney. Inside, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft padding of paws across a wooden floor. Elias Kern sat by the hearth, his face as rough as the canyon walls outside. His gray beard, thick and untamed, matched the wild look in his eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty and too little of its kindness. The firelight flickered against his worn leather coat, the only warmth in a world that seemed to grow colder with each passing year. He was a man of few words, a hunter by trade and choice, his company limited to his hound, Bristle, who lay at his feet. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of the wind, but his gaze never strayed from Elias, as if he knew his master's thoughts as well as his own. It had been 3 years since Elias had seen another soul. He had come to Deadwater Gulch to forget, to bury the ghosts of his past beneath the dry earth. There had been too many men, too many names, and too much bloodshed for one man to carry. He had been a soldier once, a tracker, a sharpshooter, someone who hunted men as easily as he hunted deer. But all of that had ended after the war, after the killing, after the boy. Bristle growled low, the sound like a warning. Elias's hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the wall, his fingers brushing the smooth, cold wood. He stood and crossed to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. The shadows of the canyon stretched long and dark, and the wind whipped the dust into swirling clouds. There was something out there, something moving. The dog's growl deepened, turning to a low, constant rumble. Elias's sharp eyes scanned the horizon. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that Bristle would not be on edge without reason. Something was out of place, something dangerous. The hound's instincts were as sharp as ever, and Elias trusted them without question. Minutes passed, each one stretching into the next. Elias stayed at the window, waiting. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but he knew he wasn't alone. Then, a sound pierced the stillness. A faint cry, almost lost in the wind. A human cry. Without a word, Elias grabbed his rifle and motioned for Bristle to follow. The dog was already on his feet, ears perked, eyes alert. They moved quickly, silently, their footsteps muffled by the dry earth beneath them. As they crested a ridge, Elias saw the figure, a woman, barely visible beneath the fading light of the day. She was lying in the dirt, her body half covered by a blanket of snow and debris. Bristle stopped at the edge of the ledge, his hackles raised. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He'd seen death before, but this was different. The woman's clothes were torn, soaked in blood, and her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light. She had been dragged through the canyon, left to die. The hound approached first, sniffing the air, then nudging the woman gently with his nose. Elias hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside her, his hand steady as he checked her pulse. It was faint, but there. She was still alive. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, her gaze unfocused. She tried to speak, but only a rasping sound escaped her throat. Elias placed a hand on her forehead, feeling the fever that had begun to set in. He knew what this was. She had been left to die. There was no telling how long she had been out here, but it was clear that whoever had done this hadn't intended for her to survive. With a grunt, Elias lifted her into his arms, the weight of her fragile form feeling unnatural in his hands. She whimpered, her face contorting in pain, but she didn't resist. The hound trotted ahead, leading the way back to the cabin. Inside, Elias laid the woman on the small cot by the fire. He worked quickly, cleaning her wounds, wrapping her in blankets. Her clothes were beyond saving, shredded by the rocks and the elements. But she would survive, if the fever didn't claim her first. The storm outside grew fiercer, and the fire crackled and popped in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Elias sat by her side, his gaze drifting to the window. There was something about this woman, something that didn't sit right. The way she had been left to die, the way her clothes were torn and stained, the way she had cried out to no one. She wasn't from around here, that much was certain. But there was something more. A mark on her wrist, an unfamiliar tattoo, a brand that looked like the emblem of an outlaw gang. It was faint, almost faded, but unmistakable. Elias knew that mark. He had seen it before. The serpent spurs. His jaw clenched as he studied her face. This was no ordinary woman. She had a past, one that would come for her, and anyone who tried to protect her. As if on cue, the hound let out a low growl from the door. Elias stood, his hand on the rifle once more. Outside, the night was silent, but the storm raged on. He had rescued her, but now he would have to face whatever followed her, and whatever followed him from the past. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill in the air. The woman, Clara, lay still on the cot, her face pale and drawn. Her fever had broken, but her body was weak, and sleep seemed to pull her under in fits and starts. Elias sat across the room, sharpening his hunting knife in silence. The rhythmic scrape of the blade against the stone was the only sound in the cabin, save for the occasional growl from Bristle, who had taken up his usual post near the door. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she gazed at the low ceiling, confused for a moment. Her brow furrowed, and she slowly turned her head to find Elias watching her. He said nothing, only continued his work, the quiet of the room hanging between them like a thick fog. "Where am I?" Her voice was raw, thin, barely more than a whisper. Elias didn't immediately answer. He had his reasons for silence, but he knew she needed something more than just the cold facts of her situation. He stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked over to the fire, adding another log. "Deadwater Gulch," he said, his voice low, rough as the land outside. "You're safe for now. Rest while you can." Clara looked around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the small, tidy space that spoke more of solitude than comfort. Her eyes lingered on the rifle resting by the door, then on Bristle, who watched her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "What happened to me?" she asked, her voice stronger now, but filled with an edge of fear. Elias hesitated, but then the truth slipped from his lips like an old wound opening up. "You were left for dead. Blood on the rocks, nearly frozen. I found you." Clara blinked, a shudder running through her. Her hand instinctively went to her wrist, where the brand, the mark of the serpent spurs, had burned into her skin. She flinched when she touched it, as if the past had been too close, too fresh. They killed my father. Took everything. And him." Her words trailed off into a hollow silence, the weight of her grief pressing down on her chest. Elias didn't press her. She had already said more than he had expected, though the tightness in her voice told him there was much she still kept hidden. He turned his attention back to the fire, but his mind began to wander, remembering the tattoo on her wrist, that unmistakable mark. The serpent spurs, a ruthless gang that had terrorized this land for years. Elias knew their leader, Boone Marrow. The man was a killer, cold, calculating, and relentless. He had a reputation that was spoken of in hushed tones. But this woman, Clara, she wasn't just a victim. She was part of something, and Elias couldn't help but wonder if the past was finally catching up with him. Clara finally sat up, wincing as pain shot through her body. Her strength was slowly returning, but the memories were slow to fade. She turned her gaze to the man sitting across from her, his face shadowed by the flickering firelight. His eyes were dark, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. But there was something else there, something that felt like a promise, a pull she couldn't quite understand. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the water jug by the hearth and poured a small amount into a cup, handing it to her. "Don't thank me yet. You're not out of the woods." Clara took the cup, her fingers brushing against his. She tried to steady her breath, but it hitched in her chest as she looked at him. "Who are you?" Elias paused. His gaze shifted away from her, the flickering flames casting shadows across his face. He stood abruptly, walking toward the window to stare out into the darkening canyon. "I'm just a man who tries to keep his head down," he said, his voice low, almost distant. Nothing more. Clara studied him for a long moment. His words didn't match his eyes. There was a hardness in him, a scar that went deeper than the skin. But there was also something else, something she couldn't quite place. It was the way he moved, the way he watched her, as if waiting for her to reveal a truth that he already knew. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice growing more persistent. He turned back to her, his eyes narrowed, as if he was measuring the weight of her question. Finally, he spoke, though his voice was barely above a murmur. "Elias." "Just Elias," she pressed. He gave a short nod, but she wasn't fooled. His silence was too deliberate, the way he avoided her gaze too telling. There was something in his past, something he hadn't shared, and she could see it. The way he held onto his name like it was a rope pulling him back from the edge of something dark. "Thank you, Elias," Clara said again, this time with a sense of finality, "for saving me." He didn't respond. Instead, he looked back out at the horizon, his hand resting on the rifle by the door. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Her thoughts spun in every direction, her mind caught in a whirlwind of memories and questions. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, but her body ached from the journey she had been forced to endure. The pain of loss was still fresh, still raw, but there was something else, a spark of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. She shifted restlessly in the bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but her mind kept drifting back to Elias. He had saved her, yes, but there was more to him than he let on. The way he handled his rifle, the way he moved in the shadows. There was a story there, and she was determined to learn it. As the hours passed, Clara made up her mind. She would leave, sooner or later. She couldn't stay here forever, hidden away from the world. The serpent spurs would come looking for her, and when they did, she would need to be ready. She had already survived too much to let fear keep her down. But Elias, she realized, was a man with his own battles. Whatever his past held, whatever it was that haunted him, it was clear that he wasn't just a simple hunter. He had a story, and she would find it, just as she would find a way to face the outlaws who had stolen everything from her. With the sound of the wind howling outside, Clara made a vow. She would survive this, and somehow, she would make sure Elias did, too. Elias awoke before the sun, as he always did. The wind had settled in the night, leaving the air cold and crisp. He could smell the dust and sagebrush outside the cabin, the scent of the canyon in his bones. The fire had dwindled to embers, but the warmth still clung to the walls, a small comfort in the vast emptiness that surrounded him. He didn't bother checking on Clara just yet. He knew she would be awake soon, and when she was, she would have questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. He moved quietly around the cabin, gathering his gear. His rifle was leaned against the wall, the stock polished from years of use, and his knife, his ever-present companion, lay next to it, as sharp as it had been the day it was made. The silence pressed in on him like a weight, the stillness of the early morning thick and heavy. He was used to the solitude, had sought it out even, but now, with Clara in his care, everything felt different. The wound in his chest, the one he had carried for years, was aching again. It wasn't physical, but something deeper. Clara had stirred something inside him that he hadn't allowed to surface in a long time. Her presence, her vulnerability. It was like a crack in the dam of his emotions, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it back. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face. Bristle trotted up to him, tail wagging lazily as the hound sniffed at the ground. Elias gave him a soft pat before turning his attention to the horizon. The canyon was quiet, the kind of quiet that was both peaceful and ominous. He'd been hunting these lands for years, but today felt different. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. As he worked, checking his traps and scanning the canyon walls, his thoughts drifted back to Clara. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, yet there was something about her that unnerved him. She had been part of something dangerous, something dark, and it was only a matter of time before the past caught up with her. He had seen enough to know what came for women like her. The serpent spurs would stop at nothing to track her down, to make her pay for whatever she had done. But Clara wasn't just a victim in this. No, she had a fire inside her, a resolve that was more dangerous than any gang of outlaws. He had seen it in her eyes, when she spoke of her father, when she touched the brand on her wrist. There was more to her than she let on, and that made her a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. The thought gnawed at him as he returned to the cabin, the weight of it settling heavily in his chest. He couldn't save her, not the way she wanted, and he certainly couldn't protect her from the ghosts of her past. The only thing he could do was keep her alive for as long as he could, but even that was becoming a harder task with every passing hour. When he stepped inside, Clara was sitting by the fire, her back straight, her eyes searching the room. She hadn't moved much since he had left, but there was something different about her now, something restless. "Morning," he said gruffly, avoiding her gaze as he set about preparing their meal. He didn't want to see the questions in her eyes, didn't want to face the inevitable moment when she would ask him what he wasn't ready to answer. Clara didn't reply right away. She simply watched him, her eyes narrowed as if she was trying to read him. Finally she spoke. "Why do you live out here?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it, a curiosity he couldn't ignore. Elias paused, his hand frozen in the act of stirring the pot over the fire. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he focused on the movement of the flames, as if they could answer for him. "Why does anyone," he muttered, his voice thick with the weight of his thoughts, "to get away, to forget?" Clara's gaze never wavered. "Forget what?" Elias set the spoon down, his hand shaking slightly as he turned to face her. There it was, the question he had known was coming. He had lived his life in silence, keeping the past buried deep, but Clara was no fool. She could see the cracks, the walls he had built to keep the world, and the pain at bay. "I lost everything," he said quietly, his voice rough, like gravel. "The war, the land, my family." His jaw tightened, the memories too sharp, too painful. "I came here to make sure I didn't lose my soul as well." Clara didn't respond right away. Her eyes softened, just slightly, as if she understood something about him, something he hadn't said. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, and for a brief moment, Elias saw a reflection of his own pain mirrored in her eyes. "Then you know what it's like to lose someone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. He didn't want to talk about it. Not with her, not with anyone. But something about her, her presence, made it harder to keep the walls up. "It's not the same," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Losing someone you love. It's a different kind of hurt." Clara's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Elias thought she might say something else. But instead, she simply nodded, as if she had already heard too many stories like his, as if she understood better than anyone what it meant to survive loss. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling through the canyon like a living thing. Bristle padded over to Elias's side, resting his head on his master's boot, sensing the tension in the air. Elias finally broke the silence. "The serpent spurs will be coming for you, Clara." She didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. Her eyes, dark and steady, met his. "I know. You can't outrun them forever." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "I've run my whole life. I'm tired of it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elias knew what she was saying. She was done being a victim. She was done hiding. But the question was, what would she do next? And more importantly, what would he do when the time came for him to make a choice? As the fire burned low, Elias knew that the past was coming for them both, whether they were ready or not. And when it did, they would have to face it together, or not at all. The sun was setting when Elias first saw the riders, their figures cutting across the horizon like dark silhouettes against the fiery orange sky. The wind had picked up again, swirling the dust in the air and carrying with it the unmistakable scent of approaching trouble. Bristle was the first to react, his hackles raised, his low growl vibrating in Elias's chest. Elias knew that sound, knew the feeling of the earth beneath his boots shifting into something dangerous. The serpent spurs had found them. "Clara," Elias called, his voice steady, though his gut was tight with the knowledge of what was coming. "Get to the back of the cabin. Don't come out unless I say so." Clara didn't argue, didn't ask questions. She just nodded, her face pale but resolute. She had already shown him that she wasn't the kind of woman to run or hide. But this time, Elias wasn't giving her a choice. He grabbed his rifle and walked to the door, his boots heavy on the wood as he stepped outside. The wind howled again, this time with a bitterness that seemed to cut through him. The riders were getting closer, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, their shadows long and ominous. Elias counted 5 of them, enough to make things interesting. Bristle stood by his side, his body coiled tight like a spring, ready for whatever was coming. Elias patted the dog's head before he knelt down and adjusted the rifle in his hands. He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving the riders as they approached. He knew their leader, Boone Marrow. The man was as cold as the steel he wore on his chest, and he had no qualms about burning everything to the ground if it suited him. When Boone Marrow's horse came into full view, Elias's heart tightened. Boone's eyes locked with his, and for a long moment the world seemed to slow. The space between them crackled with something unspoken, a history of violence and bloodshed that neither man had ever fully erased. Boone smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a grin that spoke of things far darker than anything Elias cared to remember. "You should have known better, Elias." Boone's voice carried over the wind, rough and mocking. "Hiding out here, trying to run from the past. But the past always catches up, don't it?" Elias stood tall, the rifle resting lightly in his grip, his eyes never leaving Boone's. "The past is dead, Boone. You should bury it." Boone's laugh was like the crackle of dry wood in a fire. "You always were the one with the big words," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But words don't stop bullets, do they?" The riders stopped a few paces away, their horses snorting in the thickening dust. Boone dismounted, his boots heavy on the earth, his gaze still fixed on Elias. "I'm not here to argue," Boone said, his voice taking on a cold edge. "I'm here for her." Clara's name hung in the air like a threat, and Elias felt the weight of it. He had known this was coming, had known that sooner or later Clara's past would come for her. But hearing Boone say her name with such ease made his blood run cold. He'd seen the way men like him operated, ruthless, calculating, willing to do anything to claim what they thought was theirs. Clara stepped out from behind the cabin, her face set with a determination that surprised Elias. She had a gun in her hand, though her grip on it was unsure, as if she hadn't used it much in recent years. "Stay back," Elias said without looking at her, his voice low and dangerous. She ignored him, her eyes locked on the riders. "You think I'm just going to run again?" she said, her voice steady. "You think I'm just going to let you take me back to him?" Boone raised an eyebrow. "You've got guts, girl," he said with a sneer. "But it ain't going to matter. You belong to the Serpent Spurs, and you're going to learn that sooner or later." Elias's grip tightened on his rifle. "You're wrong, Boone," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "She's not going anywhere." For a moment, everything was still. The wind stopped, the dust settled, and the world held its breath. Then, in a flash, Boone reached for his revolver. But Elias was faster. The crack of his rifle shattered the silence, and Boone's gun hand dropped, the revolver falling to the ground with a sharp clatter. Boone let out a curse, his face twisting with fury as he stumbled back. "You think you can stop me, Elias?" he growled, his voice thick with rage. "You think you can take on the whole gang? You're just a washed-up hunter." Elias's rifle was already trained on Boone again, his eyes cold and focused. "I've got no reason to stop you, but Clara does." Boone's eyes flickered to Clara, and for a moment there was something like hesitation in his gaze. But then he laughed, the sound bitter and mocking. "You think you can stop the Serpent Spurs with a rifle and a dog?" Clara raised her own gun, her hand steady now, her eyes narrowed in defiance. "I think I can stop you, Boone." Elias could see the moment Boone realized that they weren't afraid. Clara, despite her past, had found her own strength, and it was a strength that scared him. Boone's smile faltered, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "All right then," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We'll settle this the hard way." Without warning, Boone gave a signal, and the riders spurred their horses forward, guns drawn. The air erupted with gunfire, the sound deafening in the quiet of the canyon. Elias fired first, his shot ringing true as a rider fell from his horse. Bristle barked, charging forward, knocking another rider off his mount. The battle was on, and the canyon came alive with the violence of it. Elias moved swiftly, his rifle a blur as he took down another rider. Clara fired with precision, her aim steady as she shot the third man from his horse. The fourth rider hesitated, unsure of whether to charge in or retreat. That hesitation was all Elias needed. He aimed, fired, and the rider dropped, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. Boone Marrow stood alone now, fury in his eyes, his gun drawn but his hand shaking. Elias locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable. "You're done, Boone," Elias said, his voice cold and final. "This is where it ends." For a moment, there was only silence. The riders lay scattered across the canyon floor, the dust settling over them like a blanket. Boone's grip on his gun tightened, but there was no more fight in him. He knew it. Elias knew it. Boone's face twisted in anger, but he said nothing as he turned and mounted his horse, spurring it away from the cabin. The serpent spurs were finished, their reign of terror brought to a violent halt in the place where the wind always howled. As Boone disappeared into the canyon, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Elias stood silently, his rifle at his side, watching the dust settle over the battlefield. In the end, the past had caught up with them, but it hadn't won. And for the first time in a long while, Elias felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. The silence that followed was filled with something else now. Hope.